Everybody, welcome. Welcome. Okay, let's start by welcoming Rabbi Hanan Rose. Rabbi Rose arrived this past week, new director of the Intown Jewish Academy. Stay tuned and be ready for all kinds of things. All kinds of things happen when Rabbi Rose comes to town. So, heads up, next Sunday, there will be a special edition of Kabbalah and Coffee with a Pesach Kabbalah and Coffee, the mystical take on. Is your husband joining us?
Yes.
So here, Ronnie, you can pull up a chair here. The mystical take on the holiday of Passover. That'll take place here next Sunday. So I will be out of town. Okay. So very, very brief recap because we got some real juicy stuff we want to get into today. So last week we discussed that the exodus from Egypt in the spiritual service of the human being is to free the soul that because of the divine concealment that's found within all of creation and within the body itself, so the soul's consciousness of God is muted. And that brings us into a state of exile. What's a state of exile? State of exile is when who we really are, our true being, cannot be expressed. It's not free. So if our true being is our godly soul, and we're saying that the godly soul cannot be expressed, why can't it be expressed? Because there's a body and there's a world that tells us that God's not real, that God is concealed. So the exodus from Egypt is bringing a consciousness into the body so that the body does not interfere with the soul's direct consciousness of God. And then the soul is liberated from that exile. And we discussed at length that the way we do this is through meditation during prayer, that when we, during prayer, when we contemplate God's presence in the physical reality, especially this time of year where you see all the trees budding, all the different types of trees, each one on their own cycle. And then we think about the vastness of creation. We move ourselves into the cosmos, to the physical cosmos. Can you get the door, please? We move ourselves into the cosmos, the vastness of space and the galaxies and so on. And then we move ourselves into the spiritual cosmos where the angels are. The more we contemplate this and we realize how all of this doesn't affect God. God is so powerful. All of this comes into being from a shine of a ray of God's name. We're suddenly very much aware of God's presence in the world. And thus, when we encounter a challenge, something that otherwise would cause us to think that God is not present, we now have a higher consciousness. We recognize that God is present. And therefore, that thing no longer gets in our way. So you bump into a challenge at work, you bump into a health challenge, you bump into you find yourself in traffic, and otherwise you'd be all stressed out. You stop and you say, wait, God's got a plan here. God is at play here. This is not happenstance. It's not just chance, but there's a master plan. And therefore I don't have to fall apart. I can recognize that. I can begin to look for it. We had a fellow here yesterday who came here for some work, and in the process, he encountered another Jew at the work that he was at. He was here just for a week. It's the first time he came to Atlanta, and he brought that other Jew who's been living in the neighborhood for almost 2 years, was inspired by the fact that this fellow identified with his Judaism by wearing a kippah on his head, that he wanted to come to services. So why did that guy really come to Atlanta to work? He thinks he came to work in Atlanta because he needed to make some more money. But the fact is, he was there to connect someone, right? So we have the choice how we're going to use our intellectual eyes, our physical eyes, our spiritual eyes. How do we want to see the presence of God show up in the world? Do we want to see that presence? Then we'll invest ourselves in bringing a greater consciousness to sensitize ourselves to that. And then in turn, we will see the presence of God. And then we don't find ourselves stuck in exile. We don't find ourselves stuck in Egypt, where we're suddenly feeling crushed and overwhelmed and burdened by the circumstances, because we recognize there's a master plan, and that itself liberates us from that. Now, this is all as it relates to the dimension. This is all as it relates to the dimension of the Jew that we know as Israel. Israel is the dimension of the Jew, that the dimension of the soul, I should say, that that is not limited by the body, even though it lives in the body, but it's not limited by the body. But the dimension of the soul that is Jacob, well, we're not going to get into the Jacob part. The point he was emphasizing is that this is all the dimension of the Israel, the dimension of Israel within us is the dimension that is able to connect with this transcendent dimension of God. Now, we can subjugate the animal, right? We can subjugate the animal soul, not to get in the way of the godly soul. But it seems from our conversation thus far, in all the classes that we've discussed, that the animal soul needs to be kind of muted and eliminated. However, if the premise of this whole discourse is that this is a two-way journey, right? And everything in life, we strive towards something, and then we need for that thing that we've achieved to settle into us, right? So you work towards a particular goal, and then you want to be able to enjoy the goal, right? You don't sweat to build a house and then not live in it. You don't work hard to earn money and then not to be able to enjoy the efforts, right? I've thought a number of times of last year in February, I ran a half marathon. And when I was training for the half marathon, I thought to myself, like, okay, I'm already running 9-10 miles. Like, I have to go specifically Sunday morning at 6 o'clock in the morning downtown. It was raining that day. I'll go myself on Monday morning, Monday afternoon, when the weather's nicer. I'll go run a half marathon down the Beltline. I know my path. It doesn't work the same way. You need to get to the finish line where they're handing out bananas and kind bars, right? You have to experience that, and you have to be with all the people and the cheering and the screaming, and you have to see the sign markers along the way, so that when you finish, you've accomplished something. If you don't have that whole experience, it's just not it, right? It's okay. For some people, it's probably adequate, but when you're running your first half marathon, you need anyway. So the point is that every objective needs to settle back into us. Good morning. It needs to settle back into us. So, which means that if this is only a journey for the godly soul already had the spiritual connection before it came into the body. Okay, so you've liberated the godly soul from being stuck in the body, and now it feels the divine connection. But is that all it's about? Is the whole purpose here so that the godly soul can it goes into exile, so it should be liberated? Don't make the exile in the first place, and don't liberate it. But what's the whole purpose of the whole thing? Obviously, there's a greater purpose. In other words, if God is taking the soul and putting it into a body, the body is the end game here. The physical world is the end game here. Not just to eliminate the physical world, not just to eliminate the body, but that's the end game, that the body itself should experience that godliness. So if the body needs to experience that godliness, or to put it in more Kabbalistic terms, if the animal soul needs to experience, to receive the divine energy, it needs to be a fitting receptacle. It needs to be aligned, right? You can't, as we discussed, if I want to try to put this cup of coffee in this book, it's not going to work. It's going to make a big mess because the book is not a receptacle for liquid. A cup is a receptacle for liquid, and only certain types of liquid. Other types of liquid will burn the cup, right? So everything needs to, whatever is flowing in, the recipient needs to be the right type of receptacle. But the question is, how does the body become a receptacle when the body's interest is completely its own? It's completely selfish, completely self-absorbed. From the moment we're born, that's all we're interested in is me, 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 me. The whole nature of the body is self-service. So how does the body, the animal soul, become a receptacle for divine energy? This is the question that we posed last time, and we began to discuss the answer. And in a nutshell, the answer is that the body actually has a much higher source spiritually than does the soul. The body originates, physicality originates in a place that's higher than even the origin of the soul. Let that sink in for a second while I take a sip of my coffee. I'll say that again. The body's origin, its spiritual source, is higher than the soul's spiritual source. But the way it works is that when something is really high, we take two stones, one from 100 yards and one from 50 yards, and we drop them. The one from 100 yards is going to make a deeper hole in the earth than the 50 yards, right? So the animal soul's origin is much higher. So when it comes down into this world, it shows up much lower. In general, whenever you see something that seems to be lower, always know that it probably is waiting for you to do something really powerful with it. It's not to be discarded because it usually has a very high origin. So if we have a conversation with our body, we tell our body, you think that you're preoccupied with your bagel and your coffee and your own indulgences. You think that that's really what life is all about. You need to know that you actually are really powerful. You actually have an unbelievably high spiritual source. Now we got the animal soul's attention. I have a really high spiritual source. So what am I supposed to do with that? If I really have such a high spiritual source, so why do I look like an animal? You look like an animal because you have a special job to do. You have a job to do that the soul can't do. And what's your job? Your job is to recognize in your body, in your physicality, to recognize the presence of God. To utilize your animal skills, your animal talent in the service of God. It says, King Solomon says, "V'rav tuas b'koyach shar," that there is much produce, much harvest with the power of the ox. So the human being, if you put a plow on a human being and try to plow a field, you're not going to get very far. You get tired really quickly. But take that same plow and put it on the back of an ox, you suddenly can plow an entire field. So you say, wait, the ox can do something that the human can't do? Yes. When the human harnesses the ox becomes an unbelievable tool. Now, the ox can't really rationalize with us, but our body can. We can have that conversation with the body. We tell the body, the ox of the body, we say, hey, you're not just an ox. You're an ox that has the ability to do unbelievable stuff in the service of God. But you have to follow my instructions. You have to follow the instructions of the godly soul. Because if we let the body do its thing, the body is going to get lost and get lost in its own indulgences, because that's the nature of the body. But when the body is ready to listen and to be harnessed by the soul, then unbelievable things can happen. But the key is to help the body understand that its origin is very high. So when we accomplish this liberating of the godly soul from its exile within the body, the end game is not for the godly soul to fly away, but the end game is for that divine energy to come into the body, to empower the body to serve God in a way that the godly soul can never serve on its own. This experience, this transformation that we want to see happen in the body are the two acts that take place with the mitzvah that this discourse is based on, which is the act of bringing the offering of the Omer, the first harvest, on the second day of the holiday of Passover. And after harvesting the new produce, they would then bring this offering, and they would wave the offering, the Omer offering. They would wave it to and fro as many sacrifices were done in the act of its service. There was this act of waving. We're not going to get into the specifics of waving today. We're going to focus on what was the content of this offering, what is the Omer, and then the second act is the counting that took place beginning on that day for 7 weeks, 7 days, 7 times. These two acts are ultimately, remember, we left Egypt, right? We are liberating ourselves from the exile of Egypt. That's the spiritual, both physical event, but also the spiritual event that's taking place. We're liberating the soul from its exile. What's our destination? Our destination is Mount Sinai, Revelation, right? That's when we get to Mount Sinai. We're running towards Mount Sinai. That's the movement too. When we get to Mount Sinai, we're going to now digest. We're going to integrate that experience, right? That's the nature of things, where we hit the finish line and then we sit back and enjoy the fruits of our efforts, right? So what happens in between the liberating and arriving at Mount Sinai? We have the Omer offering, which is this waving that takes place. And then the counting, 7 days, 7 times, that brings us to the revelation at Sinai, when all of this accomplishment gets integrated. Okay, so we have 2 sequences going on here. We have the actual events that transpired in the desert by God's instruction, liberation from Egypt, the Omer offering, the counting of the Omer, revelation at Sinai, and we have the spiritual journey that's taking place, which is liberating the soul from its exile. Something about this waving and this counting that helps harness the animal soul, arriving to Mount Sinai when all of that effort becomes integrated. This makes sense? Any questions? And then we're going to go into the text. Don't be shy. You're among friends here.
So the process, the time period between the exit and arriving at Sinai, there's a process going on, spiritual process or adjustment.
Spiritual process, I like that. It's going on, but we are making that process happen. It's not happening to us. We are making it happen because we're instructed to count this period of time. In other words, there's something that we're doing in this process that's preparing our bodies, our physical, our animal soul, to receive the divine light, to integrate it. That's the objective here. The objective here is the soul, once the soul is liberated, it doesn't need anything else. It's ready for Sinai. It's the body that needs the transformation. And it's this process that allows for the body to experience this transformation. And it's true both whether we're talking about the specific time frame of the year or in general in life, right? Whenever we experience, I'll try to make this really practical. When we experience a challenge, let's use traffic, because that's really benign and everybody deals with it on some level, right? Somebody's in front of you, somebody cuts you off, and you get hot under the collar and you scream and you say something and you shouldn't have said it, and then you're beating yourself up why you said it. And okay, so next time when it happens, you've already decided that you're not going to react so strongly, and you just happen to wake up on the right side of the bed, you had a good coffee, and the person cuts you off in traffic, and you're in your right mind, and you say, okay, God has a master plan. I am not going to freak out. Okay, great. You just liberated your soul from the body's imprisonment, which is great. But you know what you did to your body? You controlled it. You muted it. You didn't transform the body. You know why? Me, because we don't see the body. We see the body as an interference. Why do I get so angry every time this happens? Why do I get so agitated? Right? There's something wrong with my body. There's something wrong with me. And then we remember that my father screamed at me when I was a kid, and my mother did this to me, and my great-grandfather did that, and my teacher, and I have all these conversations going on in my head, and that's why I have that reaction. Okay, so I'm going to eliminate those conversations, and but our whole attitude towards our body is that this body is a necessary evil that we have to get over or get through. The Alter Rebbe is telling us that the body's not evil, body's not bad. The stuff that you're working through, stop looking at it as an enemy. It's actually there for you to harness it. Recognize that the body has such a high source, and that's why it's showing up that way. Because when you do the work with the body to navigate through those issues, you actually unleash the body's real power, which is higher than the soul's power. It's very delicate, but it's a complete shift in our attitude towards our body. The coffee is not a bad thing. It's not even a benign thing. It's got unbelievable power. So don't look at the coffee like, okay, I have to eat food because I have to stay. I'm talking about from a soul standpoint. Nebuch, I have to eat because I have to stay alive. So I'm going to drink the coffee and eat the bagel. No. Here's opportunities. There's unbelievable stuff available here. Approach it the right way. You're going to unleash the unbelievable stuff that's available. Yeah.
I'm glad you're raising something that gives me the opportunity to ask this question about dealing with difficult people close to you in your own family who are disrespectful to you, who you go out of your way for, you do.
This is a theoretical, I'm sure.
Theoretical.
Yeah.
So no one gets offended.
Of course.
It's not Lashon Hara.
It's the same. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Every challenge we face. It's the same thing.
It's sort of like you don't want to be in front of a person who's very toxic, who's got this lots of anger and stuff against you, but it's just hard to be in that individuals because that person is exercising
For sure.
Nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
So let's put it in context. Go ahead. You want to add to the question? The context is that these are very powerful truths here, but how they translate down is very delicate because sometimes even within that truth, there are people that you need to disconnect yourself from because they interfere with your ability to truly harness your own animal soul. But you need guidance. Everybody needs guidance on that because we're very susceptible because we have a body. We're susceptible to justifying ourselves in a circumstance when really we're the one that's at fault. Or we're not showing up with the right compassion. So it's quite complex. And we can't get into every nuance, but know this to be a fact. Know this to be a truth that when we encounter difficult people, it's all part of the master plan. And there is godliness available there, whether it's within that person, whether it's within ourselves, whether it's within ourselves helping that person, or whether it's within ourselves disconnecting from that person. But there's always godliness available because nothing happens by chance. Go ahead.
I must have missed something. I understand counting the Omer and waiting in Israel, but on the way to, where's the grain coming from? Were they doing it between Egypt and
So this is again, we have to zoom the camera out. We have to zoom the camera out and understand the mitzvah in its context, even if it's only in the land of Israel. Like we have to understand it in its context. That this is the sequence of how it happens, right? So we celebrate Pesach, we count the Omer, we celebrate Shavuos, or we celebrate Pesach, we bring the Omer offering, we count the Omer, and then we celebrate Shavuos. So there's something about the structure that has its technical application, and then there is something about the structure that has its spiritual application.
That wasn't happening on the first trek from Egypt.
No, they didn't. Not to my knowledge. I don't know where they would have gotten grain from. Yeah. It was only recently that the Israelis figured out how to grow, stuff in the desert. Okay, let's move on. So now we're going to go into the text. So, and Can I see where we have it there? Okay, so we're on the second page here. Actually, where the brackets say this is indicated by the fact. See that? At the bottom there. Okay.
Far down the page.
It's towards the bottom, maybe a third from the bottom. The Omer offering was not a wheat offering, it was a barley offering. Barley, is animal food. Okay, so what do we see right out of the gate here? That the offering that we're talking about here, its objective is the animal. The objective here is the animal. That's why the offering is coming from animal food. It's not that humans don't eat barley, but barley predominantly is the main food of, it's the basis of animal fodder. So just as it is in the physical, that barley is animal food, spiritually, in the spiritual world, in the supernal realms, there is also a level of animal, something we call animal. And when we use the word animal, we mean both domesticated and wild animals. And what is the animal in heaven? What is the animal definition in the supernal realms? V'hu hamerkava ha'oyena. That is the divine chariot. What is the divine chariot? So actually on Shavuos, we read about this prophecy where the prophet Yecheskel, Ezekiel, ascended to heaven, and he gives us a recap of his journey, all the sights that he saw, all the wonderful things that he experienced. And he talks about how he saw the divine chariot. And what was on the divine chariot? The divine chariot had a Pnei Aryeh el Yamin. It had the face of a lion on the right side of the chariot, Upnei Sharmei Asmol, and the face of an ox on the left, and so on and so forth. So this divine chariot has these animals on it. Right? There's a reason why you find in synagogues on the ark sometimes the depictions are of a lion or of an ox. Right? Why are these animals there? Because they represent this prophecy that in some way or another in the divine chariot you had these images. Okay, now let's just for a second contextualize. These are not physical animals. They're not even shaped like animals. They're a spiritual being that whatever those properties in the spirit are that we would call lions or oxen, as we discussed once upon a time, the idea of the PT Cruiser, right? The PT Cruiser is a car, but in the brain of the inventor, it's made up of guts, of blood and neurons. And so if you dissected the brain of the inventor in the moment that the PT Cruiser came into his consciousness or her consciousness, you would see stuff. It wouldn't be very pleasant necessarily to look at. But there you have it, right? And if you were able to zoom in to the spiritual components or the intellectual components, the creative components of the brain, you still wouldn't see a PT Cruiser. Because even when the PT Cruiser gets translated from the guy's brain into the computer, it still doesn't look like a PT Cruiser. It's anybody knows computers here? It's made up of wires and metal and chips and whatever else goes on inside of a computer. And even when the computer is talking to the robotic arms that's cutting the metal, it still doesn't look like a PT Cruiser, right? So whatever Yechezkel, whatever the prophet saw when he went up was not the ox or the lion. It was some spiritual dimension of that from where the ox and the lion translated down. I'll give you another analogy that's brought down in Hasidic teachings. Where does the sweetness of sugar come from? Or honey? The sweetness of sugar comes from the divine attribute of chesed, the divine attribute of kindness. And where does the bitterness of a lemon come from? It comes from the divine attribute of gevura, of severity or discipline. But you can be sure that in heaven there's no sugar or lemons. So what happens? When it descends from its spiritual source and it comes through the process of the world, it translates down in this physical reality to the sweetness of sugar and the bitterness of a lemon. And there's so many things that we can find this kind of analogy within the human experience as well, where we see you take a seed and you plant it in the ground. The seed looks nothing like the apple that grows from the tree. Human reproduction, the physical being that comes out that has all this capacity to think and feel and do and so on, looks nothing like its actual origin, right? So within the physical, there's a relationship between that which is produced and its origin. But in the spiritual, we don't see that because there's a disconnect. But fundamentally, there's that connection there. So in the spiritual, you have this divine chariot that has these animals on it, right? And from this spiritual source, as it descends through the worlds, the physical animal comes into being. And those physical animals are both the ox and the lion and the lizard and the cockroach and the animal inside of us. We have to be delicate when we say this, because I remember when I was young and idealistic, I went to Universal Studios. I think I was still in yeshiva then. And I watched the animal show. And the person who was doing the animal show says, there's all kinds of animals, and we're also animals. I said, I'm not an animal. I'm not an animal. I'm a human being. Because we're not animals, but we have animal tendencies. Our body has animalistic qualities. And sometimes we could be like an animal. When we're not using the body for what it's meant to be in the service of something higher than us, then we could actually be an animal. Because what then distinguishes us from an animal? In other words, the animal is preoccupied with self. We're preoccupied with self. So what makes us any different? That we're doing it upright? Monkeys also do it upright. Okay, we can't climb trees as easily, but what separates us from the animal? So the Alter Rebbe is telling us is that just like the animal, the physical animal, the ox and the lion come from the spiritual source, so too does the animal soul within us. That also originates in the divine chariot. Mashakasuv, like it says, Al Hayam Sha'asa Shleima, Oimed Al Shtema Zerberke Shleisha Panisfeinu Chulu. So a little intro to this section. In the Book of Kings, we're introduced to this magnificent thing that King Solomon built. King Solomon was definitely an amazing architect. He loved building. He built the temple. He built this amazing palace. One of the things he built was this, it's called the Yam Shel Shlomo, the Sea of Solomon. What is the Sea of Solomon? The Sea of Solomon is this basin, massive basin. The Talmud says that the amount of water that it seems to indicate was in this basin is some kind of exaggeration, because it's not doesn't make any sense that it could actually be as such. But it was this massive basin, if I'm not mistaken, it was made out of copper, but I may be wrong. And it sat on the backs of 12 oxen. Also, I don't know if they were made out of gold or copper, but these 12 oxen. So 3 oxen facing north, 3 oxen facing south, 3 east and 3 west, right? And this gigantic basin was sitting on their backs. Is it copper or gold? It says copper. Okay, and you have an image of it, an imagined image. Very cool. Okay, so what is this all about? Like, why is this important? So the 12 oxen that are holding up this basin represent the angels. It represents the things, the angels that are in the divine chariot, and the basin, which is known as the sea, right? The sea, the ocean, that's sitting on top of it, represents the source of the angels. Now, within those of you that are familiar, we're not going to get into today, but there are 10 divine sephirot. There are 10 divine building blocks of existence that duplicates itself throughout the creative process. In its very origin, they exist as well. The very beginning of the divine contractions, the divine concealment, to bring all the world into existence. And there, the level known as malchus, kingship, is the spiritual source of the angels. And that is represented by the sea. The quality of malchus is that it conceals. Malchus has this power to conceal the divine light that it receives in order to allow only that which the recipients that are to follow can contain. Right? It's a very delicate balance, because if there's too much light, then we get fried with the divine light. We have pure ecstasy and there's no self-consciousness. Conversely, if there's not enough light, then we become complete animals. We have no divine interest. We have no higher purpose. So there has to be this delicate balance between the divine light and the concealment. That's accomplished through the quality of Malchus, through the divine sphere of Malchus. It hides the light and allows just the right amount to be manifest. The ocean conceals. That's the quality of the ocean. Right? Dry land, everything is revealed. The ocean hides. When you look out at the ocean, you don't see what's there. Every now and then a dolphin jumps up. Somebody's there, right? But the ocean doesn't let us see what's in it. That's why this basin, which represents the origin of the angels, is called the Sea of Solomon, because its job is malchus, which is to conceal, as we've been discussing, right? What's the end game? With us down here, we don't see the divine light. We think of ourselves as independent creatures. We have the capacity to look more deeply, but the sea conceals. So our origin is conceals itself so that we don't have an awareness of our origin, our source, so that we can function as independent beings. That is the divine chariot. And the sea that's above it, above these 12 oxen, is this is the spiritual level of the supernal ocean, the supernal sea. And this sea is called Bechinas Behema Rabba. This is called the great animal. Now, why is it called the great animal? So give me a second. Shem Ban Gematria Behema. The name Ban has the numeric equivalent of the word Behema, animal. Shusharish Hamarkava the Pnei Arya, which is the source of the face of the lion on the chariot. So we're going to do a little very surface but a little bit of deep diving for a minute here. So if you look at your paper that has the names of God on it. So, excuse me if my handwriting is not the best. Is there an extra copy lying around? If there's an extra one, if not, I just want to be able to reference what I'm reading here. Thank you. So if you'll look at the top, there are 4 numbers. Okay? 4 numbers: 45, 52, 63, and 72. The numeric equivalent of each of those numbers has a Hebrew corresponder. Ma, ban, sag, ab. If you ever open up a book of Kabbalah, you're going to find references to these names of God. Now, what are they? So if you're familiar with the Hebrew alphabet, great. If not, I'll try to give you the basic punchline. We're not going to do the mathematical equations today. We're just going to give the punchline. If you look in the Hebrew text, there are four things that are underlined. And these are the 4 letters of God's name as they're spelled out. The 4 letters of God's name are on the bottom of the page, the Yud and the Hey, the Vav and the Hey, right? But let's take the letter Z. How would you spell Z? If you wanted to phonetically write it, you would write Z-E-E, right? Or L, E-L. Now you might decide that E-L doesn't really capture the right pronunciation, so you would do it E-H-L. This works better in Hebrew, trust me. Okay, so in Hebrew, if we take the name of God, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, we want to spell the letters out. So how do you spell Yud? So you'll see in the Hebrew text, it's spelled Yud, Vav, Daled. How do you spell Hey? Glad you asked. There are 3 ways to spell Hey. Hey Aleph, Hey Hey, Hey Yud. How do you spell Vav? There are 3 ways to spell Vav. Vav Aleph Vav, Vav Vav, and Vav Yud Vav. Now, when you spell these out, as it is in the Hebrew text there, and you add up all of the letters that spell out God's name, you're going to have 4 conclusions. I bet you can tell me what they are. Don't be shy. Thank you very much. The 4 numbers at the top: 45, 52, 63, and 72. So these are 4 different ways God's name can be spelled. Now, this is not just, fun way to play with God's name, which some people may enjoy doing, but they actually represent different manifestations of divine energy. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? So there was a clip going around after the Chabad Rabbis Conference this year in New York, where some guy walked into a room and he held up his camera. I think it was on Instagram or TikTok or one of these things. And he said, "Hey, Rabbi." Thank you. He said, "Hey, Rabbi." It's a room full of rabbis. Said, "Hey, Rabbi." Everybody turned around, right? So Rabbi, if he was at a doctor's conference and he said, "Hey, Rabbi," everybody would be looking for the rabbi. But in a room full of rabbis, you say, what was interesting is that not even that many people turned around because it was out of context. If you're at a rabbi's conference, everybody's rabbi. So who's calling who rabbi? But if you walk into this room and you say, "Hey, Rabbi," I'm obviously going to turn around. But if I walk into my house and one of my kids says, "Hey, Rabbi," I'm going to want to see who's at the door because my kids don't call me Rabbi. If my wife calls me Rabbi, I'm really in trouble. Now, if my kid calls me by my first name, I'm also wondering what's going on here. If my kid calls me Tati or Abba or Daddy, okay. So how we are called, and I am all of those things. Mm-hmm. I am Rabbi, I'm Eliyahu, I am Tati, I'm Dad, I have all those things. I am all of those. And depending on how you call me is how I show up, right? If one of you called me Daddy, I'd say, what's going on here, right? Because that part of me doesn't show up in this kind of relationship here. So if I'm reaching out to God, I want to reach out to God in the dimension that I am intending to. I want to access a certain dimension of God. But let's say it from God's vantage point. When God is manifesting himself, he's manifesting himself differently depending on what the objective is. And there are different dimensions of God that show up more intensely because they manifest a higher dimension of God. There's God as he's manifest in the day-to-day. There's God as he's manifest in miracles. They're representing different dimensions of godliness. So these names of God, as they're spelled out in these letters, actually carry profound divine manifestation. The name Ban, the second name, the name that's 52, the numeric equivalent of that has the same numeric equivalent as the word behema, which means animal, which tells us that there's a relationship between animals and this manifestation of God. And that also tells us that the manifestation of this dimension of God as it shows up in animals means that the animal has a certain profound divine manifestation. This makes sense? We're not digging into all of the nuance here, but you have the basic equation here. The names of God are divine manifestations. And when we see a parallel between something, and obviously we're not making up these parallels, these are taught to us by the mystics, they are a manifestation. Oh man, time flies when you're having fun. They are a manifestation of the divine energy that shows up in a certain way. By the way, do you know what else has the numeric equivalent of 52? An animal? My Hebrew name, Eliyahu. So some people, you can make meaning out of that one way or the other, but I'll leave that to you. Go ahead, yes. Okay, so I was hoping you wouldn't ask. So there is an explanation, but there's a lot to this. I'll give you something else really fascinating. So truth is consistent, right? MS is consistent. Do you know which number is a number of truth?
Yeah, the letters.
Close. So MS, the word in Hebrew MS, right? So if you take out the zeros, it's 1, 40, and 400. So take out the zeros, you have 1 plus 4 plus 4 is 9. Yes? Okay. Besides the name 52, add up the numbers of all the other three names. They all equal 9. So there's a very interesting thing. I'll see if I can remember it correctly now, that the Hebrew alphabet goes till 400. But then you can continue with all the letters in the alphabet that have end letters, final letters. Let me see if we can get this right. So Chaf is 500, Mem is 600, and Nun is 700. So if we're counting that way, the Nun becomes 7, and then the 52 becomes 72, so it also adds up to 9. That's a teaching from the Rebbe's father. Huh?
It needs to be transformed.
Yeah, there's something unique about that name. And I don't remember exactly the reason the Rebbe writes why the 52 is spelled with the second number first. I'm going to look that up. Anyway, but this is a lot of fun to analyze and find parallels. But the punchline here, at its core, is that the physical animal in this world, and specifically we're talking about the animal soul, its spiritual its spiritual origin is in the divine chariot, specifically the manifestation of this name of God, the name Ban, which has the numeric equivalent of Behema, and that is where the animal below originates. Let's do a drop more. V'amarkava hanal, the aforementioned chariot, who shirish umakar l'chola behemis v'nefesh b'hamish shalamatat shemishach mimena, is the spiritual source for all the animals and the animal souls below that originate in it. It's known that the souls that we see in this world originate in the spiritual worlds. So what is new? What is the novelty in this world? It's the physicality. The physicality is the novelty in this world. But the energy of the physicality, right? Just like we use the analogy of the PT Cruiser, the car, the physical car is what's novel, but not the energy of the car. If you don't build that car consistent with the energy that it was intended to be, it's not going to work. It's not going to show up the way it was intended to be. So the physical bodies of this world, the physical bodies is the novelty of creation, but the spiritual energy has its spiritual source. And each creation has a specific spiritual source. And what distinguishes one from the other? In other words, why is it that one creation looks different than the other? It's not that the spiritual energy is tailor-made to the physical thing. The opposite is true. The physical thing originates in a particular spiritual source. So therefore, the spirituality that manifests in a particular thing is aligned with that because that's where it comes from. So the same thing is true with animals and the animal soul within the person. It originates in the supernal origin that we've been talking about, the animals that are in the divine chariot. And therefore, just as it is, listen very closely because this is really important. Just as it is, with the physical animals, certain animals are carnivores, certain animals are herbivores, certain animals like this weather, certain animals like, right? All of this stuff that's unique to each animal is a pre-programming based on their spiritual source. An ox cannot become a cat. It just can't. Doesn't work. Could want very desperately to become a cat, but it's not going to happen. Because there are certain natures that are implanted into every creation consistent with their origin. So the same thing is true of the human animal, the animal soul. That we have certain things that are planted in our nature. And those things that are planted in our nature come from the source of our animal soul, which is the angels in the divine chariot, that also have certain things planted in their nature. So what's the nature of the animals in the divine chariot? What's the nature of the angels in the divine chariot? Anybody want to take a shot at it? What is the nature? What do angels in the divine chariot do?
If they're connected between the physical plane and the spiritual plane.
Before we get to how they manifest themselves, they themselves, what's their occupation?
Direct connection to the shadow. Carry out the water.
Keep on going, throw stuff at me.
Carry out God's input.
And what does that look like? What does it look like in heaven? If you were sitting and watching the show, what would it look like? Imagine. What are they doing? So we say it in the prayers. King David tells us in the Psalms that they praise Hashem. They praise Hashem. They sit and praise God. They talk about God's greatness. There are different types of angels, but amongst these angels, there are some that are occupied with love of God and some are occupied with fear and awe of God. Some talk about God's greatness and some talk about God's awesomeness. They spend the whole day praising God because that's their programming. And that's where they live. They live in the divine space. Everything's revealed. And they spend the whole day praising God. Now, what do they eat? Animals need to eat. So what do they eat? What do animals eat? What did we say before animals eat? Barley. So they eat barley. What does barley taste like in heaven? So the barley is the sa'ira, the barley is shiur hay. The word shiur means a measurement. The measurement of the hay. The hay is 5. And here we're talking about specifically what's known as gevuros. There are 5 manifestations, there are 5 expressions of power. And what we're going to talk about is the power that we're referring to here is the power to extract divine energy from the physical world. And in a nutshell, the work that we do down here to find the godliness, this is where the animal in the body becomes so significant. The work we do down here to find the godliness within the world and to harness the godliness that's in the physical world becomes the spiritual food that the angels in heaven eat. And it's not just, we're gonna dig very deeply into that. Why do they need to eat? And what happens with that? What does that mean that they eat? What happens with that energy? Where does it get manifest? Where does it show up? So we can't do everything on one Sunday, so you have to come back. So next Sunday again will be a special Pesach Passover edition of Kabbalah and Coffee with Rabbi Hanan Rose. Welcome again. And then we'll pick it up the week after. All right, everybody have a great